He laid the foundations of modern physics, defined the laws of motion and gravity, and revolutionized our understanding of the universe. Isaac Newton, the epitome of rational thought and scientific genius. But what if the mind that unlocked the cosmos was also plagued by deep-seated paranoia, profound reclusiveness, and an obsessive fixation on secret knowledge? What if, after his most famous breakthroughs, the very isolation that fueled his brilliance began to consume him, driving him away from the world and into the shadows of alchemy and biblical prophecy? This is the untold story of Isaac Newton's later life, the psychological unraveling of a solitary genius, and the hidden battles waged within one of history's greatest minds. Welcome to Behind the Legend, where we explore the deeper, often overlooked dimensions of history's most iconic figures. In this episode, we delve into the life of Isaac Newton, not just the scientific titan whose discoveries shaped modern physics, but the increasingly isolated, paranoid, and obsessive man behind the theories. We'll explore how Newton's later years, marked by intellectual pressure, personal isolation, and a turn toward the mystical, revealed a mind wrestling with the very same forces of control and certainty that fueled his greatest achievements. Newton's life after his groundbreaking work was filled with unexpected turns. After forever altering our understanding of the natural world, he retreated into a world of seclusion and obsession, fixating on alchemy, prophecy, and theological studies. What caused this shift? Was it the intellectual pressure of his own towering genius? The cost of being misunderstood or even criticized by his peers? Or did a deeper psychological unraveling contribute to the man who spent the last years of his life obsessed with the search for ultimate truth, far removed from the realm of rational science? In this exploration, we'll examine the complex psychology of Isaac Newton, a genius driven by both reason and fear, whose internal battles led him down a path toward deep isolation, paranoia, and an obsession with the occult. Isaac Newton's early life laid the foundation for much of the internal struggle that would define his later years. Born prematurely on January 4, 1643, Newton's early years were marked by personal loss and the kind of isolation that would deeply affect his psychological development. His father, a prosperous farmer, died 3 months before he was born, and his mother, Hannah Asko, remarried when he was 3, leaving Newton to be raised by his maternal grandmother. This early lack of consistent parental presence may have instilled a sense of abandonment in him, a pattern that would later contribute to his reclusive tendencies and intense emotional distance from others. From a young age, Newton showed an intense focus on intellectual pursuits, often at the expense of social interaction. Unlike many of his peers, who were often absorbed in the social life of their communities, Newton immersed himself in books and intellectual challenges, exhibiting a fascination with mechanics, mathematics, and the natural world. His years at Trinity College, Cambridge, further cemented his position as a brilliant, albeit solitary, scholar. The intense dedication to his studies, coupled with the pressures of academic life, meant that Newton was not only isolated from his family, but also from the broader social world. Newton's social anxiety was evident during his time at Cambridge, where he kept to himself and was described as having little interest in forming friendships. His reclusiveness wasn't just a matter of personal preference. It was rooted in something deeper, a psychological mechanism to protect himself from feelings of inadequacy and the intense competition at Cambridge. This social detachment was a direct result of his profound intellectual focus, but it also set the stage for the paranoia and emotional isolation that would define his later years. In 1665, a pivotal moment in Newton's life came with the outbreak of the bubonic plague, which forced Cambridge to close. During this period of enforced isolation, Newton retreated to his family's farm in Woolsthorpe, and it was here that he experienced his intellectual renaissance, developing much of his foundational work in mathematics and physics. In this quiet, isolated space, Newton formulated the principles of calculus, discovered the nature of light, and conceptualized the laws of motion and gravity. This Annus Mirabilis, the Year of Wonders, was also a year of solitude, where Newton's intellect thrived, but his emotional and social isolation deepened. During this period, the solitude that Newton experienced was not merely a temporary retreat, It was a state of being that he would grow accustomed to and, in some respects, crave for the remainder of his life. As he continued to engage with scientific and mathematical problems that consumed his focus, he simultaneously withdrew further from public life, isolating himself not just physically, but emotionally. The intensity of his intellectual curiosity, combined with the social anxieties and personal loss of his earlier years, may have formed the basis of the deep psychological strain that would come to define his later life. In retrospect, Newton's early life and education reveal a man who, although brilliant, was psychologically fragile. His intellectual intensity was matched by emotional vulnerability, and this combination led him to prioritize his work over relationships, leaving him isolated from family and friends. This early isolation, while fostering his genius, also created an environment where paranoia and social anxiety could take root, factors that would become more pronounced as Newton grew older and his fame and intellectual power expanded. Isaac Newton's intellectual brilliance, however, came at a high personal cost. After his groundbreaking contributions to mathematics and physics, including the formulation of the laws of motion and universal gravitation, Newton found himself thrust into the public spotlight. But with this acclaim came intense intellectual and personal pressure, as well as the beginnings of a deep paranoia that would follow him throughout his life. Perhaps the most famous and psychologically impactful conflict Newton faced was his bitter dispute with the German philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz over the invention of calculus. Although both men developed similar theories of calculus independently, it was Newton who had the earlier claim. However, Leibniz published his work first, and the resulting public conflict between the two was vicious. Newton, fiercely protective of his intellectual property, felt deeply affronted by Leibniz's success and the challenge to his own accomplishments. This dispute became not just a professional rivalry, but a personal vendetta. Newton's response to the accusations and public disputes surrounding his work was often characterized by sharp defensiveness, a refusal to collaborate, and a retreat into isolation. He not only denounced Leibniz's claims, but also used his considerable influence at the Royal Society to discredit Leibniz and his work. This conflict, which lasted for decades, revealed the psychological toll that intellectual property disputes took on Newton. The paranoia of someone trying to protect their most prized creations from the world's scrutiny and competition was evident in Newton's actions. At the heart of this conflict was Newton's deep sensitivity to criticism and his fear of having his work undermined. His genius was not just a source of pride, it became, in his mind, something that needed to be fiercely defended. This psychological defensiveness only grew over time, and it influenced his behavior in all aspects of his life. Newton did not take criticism lightly and often viewed any challenge to his work as a personal attack. His sense of intellectual ownership became inseparable from his identity, and the fear of having his reputation tarnished by perceived plagiarism or theft consumed him. His intense focus on protecting his intellectual territory came at the expense of relationships with other scientists and scholars. He became less collaborative, more reclusive, and more paranoid about the possibility of others claiming what he believed to be his own discoveries. The profound impact of this paranoia and defensiveness can be seen in Newton's relationships with colleagues. He was known to be distrustful of other scientists, especially those who questioned or contradicted his work. His bitterness toward Leibniz, for example, persisted long after the calculus controversy had subsided. Newton's inability to reconcile with others over intellectual matters only deepened his sense of isolation and paranoia. The more he focused on defending his work, the more he retreated from the intellectual community. Where once he might have sought collaboration and shared ideas, he now saw the world through a lens of intellectual competition and potential betrayal. Beyond his scientific disputes, Newton also faced intense criticism of his work in optics. His theory of color and light, based on his experiments with prisms, was groundbreaking, but it was also controversial. The English scientist Robert Hooke, who was a member of the Royal Society, publicly challenged Newton's ideas about light. Newton's reaction to Hooke's critiques was not just defensive, it was intensely personal. Newton, who had struggled with his sense of self-worth throughout his life, took Hooke's criticisms as direct attacks on his intellectual credibility. Hooke's challenges were seen not as constructive criticism, but as an existential threat to Newton's intellectual legacy. The combined effect of these disputes with Leibniz and Hooke likely amplified Newton's growing paranoia. The more he was criticized or challenged, the more intensely he protected his reputation, retreating even further into his own thoughts. The desire to protect his theories became an obsession, and the need for intellectual dominance became tied to his sense of self-esteem. With every conflict, Newton distanced himself further from the world of open collaboration and constructive debate, choosing instead to protect his intellectual kingdom at all costs. In many ways, Newton's paranoia about intellectual theft reflects a deeper insecurity, a fear that the very foundation of his genius would be undermined by others. For a man who had shaped the scientific revolution, whose theories and work had radically altered the way the world understood nature, this fear was understandable. But it was also the source of great psychological strain. Newton's personal and professional identity became increasingly entangled with the defense of his ideas, a struggle that left him emotionally and socially isolated. The psychological impact of these controversies may have contributed to Newton's retreat into the world of alchemy and theology in his later years. Unable to find intellectual peace in the competitive world of scientific discovery, Newton turned toward pursuits that allowed him to maintain a sense of intellectual control. Subjects like alchemy and biblical prophecy, where he could search for answers on his own terms. These esoteric studies allowed him to remain immersed in intellectual work while avoiding the challenges and conflicts of mainstream science, which had become increasingly adversarial in his mind. Newton's paranoia was not just about the theft of his ideas. It was also about control over knowledge, truth, and legacy. His intense focus on maintaining ownership of his intellectual discoveries became not just about his work, but about preserving his own identity and place in history. The scientific community had become a battlefield, and Newton, once an open-minded innovator, had become a solitary and defensive figure, guarding his intellectual empire with increasing fervor. As Isaac Newton's career advanced, so did his obsession with the mysteries of the universe. While his fame rested upon his revolutionary work in mathematics and physics, much of his intellectual energy in his later years was devoted to pursuits that were considered esoteric: alchemy, biblical prophecy, and theology. These studies, which he kept secret for much of his life, reveal a psychological dimension of Newton's character that was less about empirical science and more about seeking answers to the ultimate questions of existence. Newton's interest in alchemy was not a passing hobby, but rather a deeply obsessive pursuit that spanned much of his life. Alchemy in the 17th century was not viewed merely as a precursor to modern chemistry. It was a complex philosophical system with its own intellectual and spiritual framework. For Newton, alchemy was not just about turning base metals into gold. It was about uncovering hidden truths about the workings of the universe. The alchemists sought to understand the divine order behind the natural world, and Newton, ever the seeker of ultimate knowledge, found in alchemy a pathway to exploring these questions. Newton's alchemical studies were extensive and meticulous. He wrote thousands of pages on alchemical subjects, experimenting with substances and searching for the philosopher's stone, a legendary substance that was said to turn base metals into gold and grant immortality. Yet, despite the significant amount of time he dedicated to these studies, Newton kept them largely secret. The prevailing view of alchemy in his time was that it was a pseudoscience associated with mysticism and superstition. For someone of Newton's stature, to publicly pursue alchemy would have been a risk to his reputation. And yet, these studies consumed him in ways that his scientific work did not. The question then becomes, what drew a man of Newton's rational intellect into a world that seemed so disconnected from the empirical and logical thinking he championed? One possible answer lies in his obsessive search for a universal truth. Newton was a man driven by an insatiable desire to understand the fundamental laws of nature. He had unlocked the mechanical workings of the universe with his laws of motion and theory of gravity. But there remained questions that his scientific work could not answer. Questions about the purpose of life, the nature of the divine, and the ultimate causes behind the observable phenomena. In many ways, alchemy represented Newton's search for a deeper, more metaphysical understanding of the universe, one that could not be explained solely through scientific observation and mathematical principles. His work in alchemy was an attempt to find a unifying principle that could bridge the gap between the known, physical world and the unknown, spiritual realm. This psychological drive toward a deeper, more profound knowledge led him to study ancient texts and to investigate alchemical symbols and processes. He sought, perhaps, a connection between the divine and the natural world, a harmony that could be achieved through the understanding of both the physical and metaphysical. This pursuit of hidden knowledge also extended to theology. Newton, like many of his contemporaries, was deeply religious, and his religious studies were inextricably linked to his quest for truth. In fact, his theological writings outnumbered his published scientific work, and he devoted much of his time to biblical prophecy, attempting to decode the secrets of the Bible. He spent years attempting to calculate the exact date of the apocalypse, using the Bible as a mathematical and prophetic text. Newton believed that the key to understanding the future and the workings of the universe lay in God's divine plan, and he felt that only by unlocking the secrets of sacred texts could he gain the full understanding of God's design for the world. Newton's religious studies were rooted in a unique interpretation of Christian doctrine. He rejected many traditional Christian teachings, including the doctrine of the Trinity, which he viewed as a corrupt and nonsensical idea. His heretical views on theology, combined with his obsessive study of ancient texts, were a way for him to assert his control over knowledge in a domain that was far more subjective than the physical world of science. While his scientific work was methodical, systematic, and grounded in observation, his religious and alchemical studies were driven by an unrelenting desire to make sense of the unknown. From a psychological perspective, these pursuits can be understood as an attempt by Newton to find certainty in areas where rational science could not provide answers. The laws of physics had given him mastery over the physical world, but in his later years, Newton became increasingly preoccupied with areas that were outside the reach of science. His obsessive need to uncover the deepest secrets of existence speaks to a common psychological trait in individuals of extraordinary intellect: the desire to gain control over all aspects of reality, including those that cannot be directly observed or measured. The question of why Newton turned to these occult studies after achieving scientific greatness speaks to a deeper psychological dynamic. Despite his towering success, Newton may have felt a profound sense of intellectual incompleteness. His scientific achievements, although groundbreaking, did not satisfy his need for ultimate answers. The laws of motion and gravity, for all their beauty and precision, could not explain the divine order of the universe or the nature of God. As Newton's fame as a scientist grew, so too did his internal search for answers that went beyond the realm of mathematics and physics. Alchemy and theology became his refuge, where he could continue his search for absolute knowledge, even if that meant venturing into realms that were considered irrational by many of his peers. This obsession with uncovering hidden knowledge and his immersion in esoteric pursuits can also be understood as a psychological mechanism for maintaining control in an increasingly complex and demanding world. As Newton faced personal and intellectual rivalries, as well as the pressures of fame, he turned inward, seeking solace in areas of study where he could still assert intellectual dominance. By immersing himself in alchemy and prophecy, Newton was able to hold on to a sense of control over the mysteries of the world that eluded him through science alone. The psychological drive behind Newton's alchemical and theological studies is a testament to the power of intellectual obsession. For all his scientific genius, Newton struggled with the limitations of rational thought, and this struggle led him to search for deeper, more esoteric truths that could provide him with a sense of completeness. In this sense, his alchemical and theological pursuits were not just an escape from the demands of science. They were an extension of his obsessive need to understand everything, to to uncover the ultimate truths of existence. After his groundbreaking scientific discoveries, Isaac Newton's life took a drastic shift. While the world revered him for his intellectual achievements, Newton began to retreat into reclusiveness, focused more on his obscure, esoteric studies than on contributing to the scientific community. He stepped further into isolation, abandoning the vibrant intellectual exchange he had once thrived in. His move away from the public stage, coupled with his obsession with alchemy and theology, marked the later years of his life as a time of growing psychological distress. Newton's retreat from public life began in earnest after his tenure as Warden of the Royal Mint. Although this position was an important role, overseeing England's currency and combating counterfeiting, it was far removed from the intellectual arenas that had previously been his focus. The shift from theoretical science to administrative work seemed to catalyze his withdrawal from the world of collaboration, pushing him deeper into solitude. His role at the Mint brought him power and status, but it did little to ease his increasingly paranoid and anxious state of mind. Newton, once celebrated for his work on the Principia and his contributions to mathematics and physics, now seemed more concerned with defending his legacy than with engaging in fresh scientific endeavors. It is during these years that Newton's psychological state became even more complicated. He became increasingly bitter, isolated, and withdrawn. His paranoia, already evident in his disputes with Leibniz and Hooke, grew more intense. Newton became obsessed with his enemies, perceived and real, continuing to hold grudges and obsess over those who challenged his authority in science and even in personal matters. His intense desire for control over his intellectual property and legacy led him to shut himself off from many of his contemporaries, refusing to entertain collaboration or new ideas. Newton's reclusiveness also grew as he retreated into his alchemical experiments. Alchemy, while considered a fringe science at the time, provided Newton with a sense of control over the mysteries of the universe that his more rational scientific pursuits could not. He spent countless hours alone, working on experiments that, by modern standards, would have been seen as irrational. Yet for Newton, these experiments were not just about discovering hidden scientific truths. They were a way for him to assert mastery over the mysteries of existence. Alchemy allowed him to pursue something beyond the realm of empirical science, where the rules of logic and observation had their limits. This deep immersion in alchemy and occult knowledge is both a testament to his genius and a reflection of his growing psychological isolation. Newton's obsession with alchemy could be seen as an attempt to reconcile his intellectual need for order and certainty with his spiritual and existential doubts. The search for the philosopher's stone, a mythical substance believed to turn base metals into gold and grant eternal life, was not just a scientific pursuit for Newton. It was a symbolic quest to control and understand the hidden forces of the universe. This fixation with alchemy is often seen as a retreat from reality, a way to avoid the uncertainties of the world that his scientific theories had yet to explain. The psychological implications of this retreat are significant. Newton's shift from engaging with the scientific community to immersing himself in these solitary esoteric studies points to the mental strain that accompanied his genius. The pressures of fame, constant criticism, and intellectual rivalry likely took a toll on his mental health, pushing him into reclusiveness and obsessive behavior. While his early career had been marked by bold ideas and breakthroughs, his later years were characterized by an increasing sense of isolation and paranoia. This transformation raises important questions about the psychological cost of intellectual greatness. In his later years, Newton was not only isolated from the scientific world, but also from close relationships. Despite his fame and high social status, Newton had very few personal connections. His personal life remained largely solitary, with little record of lasting friendships or romantic relationships. He was known to have avoided social gatherings and had little interest in interacting with his peers unless it was necessary for his work. This intense isolation likely compounded his psychological struggles, leaving him vulnerable to the kind of paranoia that would come to define his later years. It is also worth noting that Newton's reclusiveness, while often seen as a personal flaw, may have been partly a reflection of the intellectual and emotional toll that his genius took on him. The immense pressure of having revolutionized entire fields of study, coupled with the constant intellectual challenges he faced, may have pushed him to withdraw from the public sphere. He may have felt a profound sense of responsibility to defend his legacy, as well as a deep fear that any further interaction with others could tarnish the reputation he had so carefully built. The paranoia that developed during this time reflects the complex relationship between genius and mental well-being. What is also striking about this period is that Newton's mental state and reclusiveness were accompanied by an increasingly intense focus on subjects that many of his peers saw as irrational. His alchemical and theological pursuits, once regarded as fringe interests, consumed him to the point where they overshadowed his earlier scientific work. His obsession with biblical prophecy, in particular, became a major part of his intellectual focus. Newton believed that he could decode the mysteries of the Bible using his mathematical and scientific approach, and he dedicated a significant portion of his later life to interpreting ancient texts and trying to predict the future. This shift in focus from the empirical to the mystical, from the scientific to the religious, speaks volumes about Newton's psychological state. His need for absolute certainty, whether in science, alchemy, or religion, became so overpowering that it led him away from the empirical world of experimentation and into a realm of mysticism and speculation. Newton's obsession with these occult and theological pursuits can be seen as an attempt to find ultimate control over knowledge, a pursuit that went far beyond the intellectual rigor that had characterized his earlier work. His withdrawal from the scientific community and his increasing obsession with esoteric subjects also highlighted his growing paranoia. Newton felt the weight of the world's expectations, and he became increasingly concerned with preserving his legacy and protecting his intellectual property. The need to control knowledge, to ensure that no one could surpass or discredit him, became a central aspect of his later life. The reclusive period of Newton's life thus reveals a deep psychological conflict, a brilliant mind seeking answers to the most profound questions of existence while struggling to reconcile his intellectual legacy with his personal insecurities and fears. His retreat into alchemy and theology, far from being an eccentricity, can be understood as a response to the immense intellectual pressure he faced. Newton's journey from groundbreaking scientist to isolated alchemist provides a powerful glimpse into the psychological cost of genius and the toll that isolation, obsession, and paranoia can take on the human mind. Isaac Newton's later years were marked by an obsession that ran far deeper than his already intense intellectual pursuits. Once the architect of the scientific revolution, Newton's focus shifted from the physical laws of nature to the more abstract, mysterious, and often irrational realms of alchemy, biblical prophecy, and mystical studies. The psychological complexity behind this shift is fascinating. It wasn't simply about a scientist indulging in obscure interests. Instead, Newton's intense desire to control and understand everything around him led him to seek out knowledge beyond the observable world. This obsession with absolute truth and certainty eventually permeated every aspect of his life. Newton's need for control and understanding was not merely an intellectual pursuit, it was psychological in nature. His brilliance in mathematics and physics had allowed him to crack the code of the natural world. The laws of motion and gravity were seemingly absolute truths that governed everything from the fall of an apple to the movement of planets. But this mastery over the physical universe came with a psychological cost. It left him yearning for even greater control over areas of life that defied logic and rationality. His scientific theories, which provided him with such clarity and certainty, were unable to offer answers to the ultimate questions he had about existence. This drove Newton toward the esoteric, where he believed deeper, hidden truths could be found. Alchemical studies, which for many of his contemporaries were considered little more than superstition, were for Newton an intellectual exercise in seeking universal knowledge. He was not simply searching for a way to turn base metals into gold. Newton saw alchemy as a way to uncover the mysteries of the universe itself. Through alchemy, He hoped to find a way to manipulate nature's most fundamental forces and uncover the hidden patterns of the world. This obsession with understanding the mysteries of life became an all-consuming endeavor that overtook his earlier, more celebrated work. His alchemical experiments were not about achieving practical results. They were an expression of his desire to exert control over something that science alone could not explain. The psychological significance of this obsession cannot be understated. Newton's need to master every aspect of reality, whether through his groundbreaking scientific theories or his pursuit of alchemical secrets, stemmed from a desire for absolute knowledge. He wanted to understand everything, not just the observable world, but the hidden, mystical forces that he believed governed all existence. The fact that these pursuits were so secretive and often ridiculed by the scientific community suggests a deeper need to possess knowledge that could not be easily challenged or tested by others. For Newton, control over knowledge was synonymous with control over the universe itself. His obsessive quest for truth was an attempt to make sense of an existence he saw as full of chaos and uncertainty. By controlling knowledge, he could impose order and meaning on the world. This obsessive pursuit of knowledge was also tied to Newton's increasing paranoia. As he withdrew from the scientific community and became more immersed in alchemy and theology, he grew increasingly distrustful of others. The psychological need for control, which was a hallmark of his intellectual pursuits, began to seep into his personal life. Newton's paranoia became evident in his relationships, or lack thereof. He had few close personal connections and became notorious for his suspicion of others. This lack of trust was particularly apparent in his ongoing disputes with contemporaries, from the famous rivalry with Leibniz over the invention of calculus to his bitter, unrelenting animosity toward Robert Hooke. These disputes, fueled by Newton's obsessive need to protect his intellectual property and reputation, also reflected his deep-seated fear that others might expose him as vulnerable, or worse, surpass him. Newton's fierce defensiveness and emotional distance from his peers were not merely a result of intellectual differences. They were a manifestation of the deep paranoia that began to consume him. He feared not only the theft of his ideas, but also the potential discrediting of his life's work. This fear may have driven him to retreat further into his alchemical and theological studies, where he could seek control and certainty on his own terms, outside the reach of judgment from his peers. The shift in Newton's intellectual focus, from empirical science to esoteric pursuits, was also a psychological defense mechanism. Science had given him immense intellectual power, but the complexities of the universe, questions about life, death, and the divine, remained beyond his grasp. As a result, Newton's desire for knowledge became increasingly tied to the search for something beyond the physical world. He sought answers that could not be quantified or measured, turning to alchemy and prophecy as a way to answer the existential questions that science had not. In this way, his obsession with absolute knowledge shifted from the rational to the irrational. His genius, once firmly grounded in the physical and observable world, now sought to transcend the boundaries of reality itself. Newton's retreat into these mystical and occult studies can also be seen as a manifestation of his deep psychological isolation. Despite his fame and his pivotal role in shaping modern science, Newton was profoundly lonely. His obsession with knowledge, intellectual control, and protecting his legacy distanced him from others, both personally and professionally. He was consumed by his own thoughts, by the unrelenting pursuit of answers to questions that, ultimately, could not be solved through empirical means. The more he sought to understand and control the universe, the more disconnected he became from the world around him. His brilliant mind, once a source of groundbreaking discoveries, became trapped in a labyrinth of obsession, paranoia, and intellectual isolation. The complex relationship between Newton's genius and his psychological state raises important questions about the cost of intellectual greatness. Was it inevitable that someone with such an intense drive for knowledge would become consumed by their own search for absolute truth? Newton's later years show us how obsession and the quest for certainty can at times become self-destructive. His ability to explain the physical universe in unprecedented ways did not provide him with the comfort or peace he sought. Instead, his need for complete understanding drove him further away from the world he had once helped to revolutionize, leading him into the shadows of alchemy, prophecy, and secrecy. Isaac Newton's legacy is often viewed through the lens of his groundbreaking scientific achievements. His work in physics, mathematics, and optics fundamentally altered humanity's understanding of the natural world, and he is celebrated as one of the most influential figures in the history of science. However, his later years, marked by intense paranoia, intellectual obsession, and reclusiveness, reveal the deeply human side of the scientific genius. While his discoveries illuminated the universe, they also left him grappling with his own psychological turmoil. The contrast between the public Newton, the brilliant, confident scientist, and the private Newton, the paranoid, reclusive figure obsessed with alchemy and biblical prophecy, is stark. His later years remind us that even the most brilliant minds are not immune to the vulnerabilities of the human experience. Newton's genius did not shield him from psychological distress, nor did it protect him from the existential questions and doubts that plague every human being. One of the most striking aspects of Newton's later life is the way his profound intellectual achievements seemed to fuel, rather than alleviate, his personal struggles. His search for the fundamental laws of nature brought him acclaim and respect, yet it was also a relentless pursuit that left little room for emotional connection or personal fulfillment. His mind, which had so brilliantly deciphered the physical universe, could not find peace when it came to the larger, metaphysical questions that surrounded him. In his later years, Newton turned to alchemy and theology in an attempt to find answers to questions that his scientific work could not address. Yet these pursuits, while deeply meaningful to him, only drove him further into isolation. The psychological cost of Newton's brilliance is evident in his intense obsession with controlling knowledge and preserving his intellectual legacy. His battles with Leibniz over calculus, his animosity toward Robert Hooke, and his retreat into occult studies all point to a man who was profoundly fearful of losing control over his ideas and his reputation. These fears, rooted in a deep-seated insecurity, ultimately overshadowed his ability to collaborate or engage in the intellectual community. Newton's paranoia prevented him from embracing the open exchange of ideas that had fueled the scientific revolution. He saw criticism as a threat, and this defensive mindset became a barrier to intellectual growth and personal connection. But beyond his intellectual battles and reclusive behavior, Newton's later life raises larger philosophical and psychological questions about the nature of genius. How much does intellectual greatness come at the cost of personal well-being? What is the price of a life dedicated entirely to the pursuit of knowledge? Newton's obsessive search for absolute truth, while it yielded incredible discoveries, also led him down paths that isolated him from others and left him emotionally disconnected. His inability to reconcile his intellectual accomplishments with his emotional needs highlights the complex relationship between genius and mental health. Newton's psychological struggles are not unique to him alone. They reflect the universal human condition. In the pursuit of meaning, whether through science, religion, or other forms of inquiry, we all seek answers to the profound mysteries of existence. Newton's quest for understanding transcended the realms of science and moved into areas that have traditionally been considered irrational, such as alchemy and prophecy. His search for knowledge was, in many ways, a search for meaning, a way to find order and control in a world that was far more complex than any scientific equation could explain. This human desire for meaning is something that all of us can relate to, whether we are intellectuals, creatives, or simply individuals seeking to understand the world around us. In this light, Newton's story teaches us that intellectual achievement alone cannot fill the void of human connection and understanding. His reclusiveness and obsession with hidden knowledge were not simply a result of his intellectual brilliance, but also a symptom of a deeper psychological need for control and certainty. Newton sought absolute answers to questions that lay beyond the reach of empirical science, and in doing so, he lost touch with the very things that make us human: relationships, emotions, and the ability to accept the unknown. His genius, while revolutionary, did not spare him from the vulnerabilities of the human experience. Newton's legacy also speaks to the tension between the rational and the irrational, the known and the unknown. His scientific work was grounded in observation, experimentation, and logic. But as he aged, Newton's mind sought answers in realms that science could not explain: alchemy, prophecy, and theology. These pursuits, while unconventional and often dismissed by his contemporaries, were a natural extension of his desire to understand the fundamental nature of reality. In his later years, Newton sought to reconcile the rational with the mystical, the physical with the spiritual, and the empirical with the transcendent. His legacy, therefore, is not just one of scientific achievement, but also one of philosophical inquiry that bridged the gap between the known and the unknown. Newton's later life serves as a reminder that even the most brilliant minds are subject to the complexities of the human condition. His intellectual achievements, though monumental, did not protect him from the psychological struggles that so often accompany greatness. His story teaches us that genius, while extraordinary, is not a shield from vulnerability. It is a reminder that even those who shape the world around us are still, at their core, human. Isaac Newton's life presents a paradox that speaks to the complex nature of intellectual greatness. On one hand, his contributions to science, mathematics, and physics are the foundation of modern understanding in many fields, a towering achievement that changed the course of history. On the other hand, his later years were marked by paranoia, obsessive behavior, and a retreat into mystical studies. His life offers powerful insights into the psychological cost of genius, the search for ultimate truth, and the human drive to find meaning in a complex world. Newton's struggles reveal that even the greatest minds are not immune to personal vulnerabilities, and in doing so, his life offers universal lessons for anyone striving for excellence while navigating the delicate balance between ambition, connection, and self-preservation. One of the most profound lessons we can draw from Newton's story is the importance of balance. Newton's early work in mathematics and physics was groundbreaking, but it consumed him entirely. He dedicated himself to a singular pursuit of understanding the natural world, pushing the boundaries of human knowledge. Yet, in his later years, his singular focus on intellectual achievement became a source of psychological strain. His obsessive drive for absolute certainty and control over knowledge led to an emotional and social disconnect. As he distanced himself from others, his mental health began to deteriorate, and he retreated further into esoteric studies that offered him no real connection with the world around him. In our own lives, whether in creative endeavors, business, or personal growth, we can often be seduced by the pursuit of excellence. But Newton's life teaches us that an obsessive focus on a single goal or pursuit, without room for emotional engagement or connection, can ultimately lead to isolation, burnout, and dissatisfaction. While ambition can drive us to achieve incredible things, it is the balance between passion and connection that sustains us. Newton's story encourages us to consider the emotional and psychological costs of our own pursuits and to find ways to engage with the world, whether through relationships, collaboration, or self-care, to maintain our mental well-being. Another lesson from Newton's life is the challenge of dealing with criticism and the fear of failure. As a brilliant mind, Newton was deeply sensitive to challenges to his work and reputation. His paranoia about others stealing his ideas and his inability to handle criticism contributed to his reclusive behavior. The bitter disputes with Leibniz and Hooke reveal a man who was not only intellectually defensive, but emotionally vulnerable. The desire to preserve his intellectual property at all costs consumed him, and the fear of failure or discrediting his legacy made him hesitant to engage with others or collaborate. This fear of failure is something many of us can relate to, especially in today's highly competitive world. Whether we are launching a new project, publishing creative work, or navigating personal goals, the fear of being criticized or not living up to expectations can be overwhelming. Newton's life teaches us that while we should be proud of our achievements, we must also be able to take criticism and learn from it without letting it diminish our sense of self-worth. The path to growth is not linear, and it involves vulnerability, embracing the possibility of failure as part of the process. By accepting feedback, criticism, and even mistakes, we can evolve and continue to create meaningful work without being paralyzed by the fear of judgment. Newton's retreat into alchemy and theology also highlights the universal human desire to understand the deeper mysteries of existence. While his obsessive pursuit of these subjects may seem irrational in retrospect, it reflects a common psychological drive to seek meaning beyond the visible, physical world. For Newton, alchemy and biblical prophecy were not merely obscure interests. They were his way of addressing the limits of scientific knowledge and grappling with questions that were outside the scope of his rational thinking. His turn to mystical studies was a reflection of his desire to find answers to the most profound questions of existence: the nature of God, the meaning of life, and the mysteries of the universe. In many ways, this pursuit of meaning beyond the empirical world is something that resonates with all of us. Whether we turn to philosophy, religion, or art, we are often seeking to understand something deeper about our purpose and our place in the universe. Newton's life reminds us that the quest for meaning is not confined to the physical or logical realms, but also involves the spiritual and emotional dimensions of our experience. While it is important to approach life with a rational mindset, it is equally important to acknowledge the intangible aspects of existence that science cannot explain. Newton's exploration of these realms, though often dismissed by his peers, highlights the depth of human curiosity and the desire for a holistic understanding of the world. Moreover, Newton's life emphasizes the importance of intellectual curiosity and the value of lifelong learning. Even after revolutionizing the field of science, Newton's mind remained restless, always searching for deeper truths and trying to uncover mysteries that eluded him. This unquenchable thirst for knowledge is a trait shared by many great thinkers, artists, and innovators. The lesson here is clear: we should never stop exploring, questioning, and learning. Intellectual growth doesn't end with a single breakthrough. It is a lifelong journey. Newton's obsessive pursuit of knowledge, although it led him down some dark and isolating paths, also shows the power of a mind dedicated to understanding the unknown. It serves as a reminder that our curiosity is a vital force in driving us forward, even when the answers we seek may be elusive. Finally, Newton's story speaks to the complexities of the human condition. We often view geniuses as being somehow immune to the struggles and vulnerabilities that affect the rest of us. Yet Newton's life shows that even the brightest minds are not free from internal battles. His later years, marked by paranoia, obsession, and isolation, reveal the hidden toll of intellectual greatness. Genius is not a shield against human flaws. It is, in many ways, a magnification of them. Newton's struggles with isolation and paranoia are reminders that all individuals, regardless of their achievements, face internal challenges that must be managed. His story urges us to embrace the full spectrum of the human experience, recognizing both the brilliance and the vulnerabilities that define us. Isaac Newton's later life offers a compelling case study in the psychological costs of greatness. His brilliance revolutionized science, but his obsessive drive, paranoia, and retreat into reclusiveness also demonstrate the profound human toll that intense intellectual pursuit can exact. As we reflect on Newton's experiences, there are valuable lessons we can apply to our own lives, whether we are engaged in creative, intellectual, or professional pursuits. These lessons can help us navigate the pressures of success and ensure that our own journeys are marked by balance, emotional health, and connection with others. Firstly, embracing a balance between passion and well-being is essential. One of the most important lessons we can draw from Newton's life is the need to balance intense intellectual focus with emotional well-being. Newton's dedication to his work was unmatched, yet it led him down a path of isolation, obsession, and paranoia. His ability to concentrate on his theories and ideas allowed him to make breakthroughs that changed the world. But his refusal to engage socially and emotionally with others left him vulnerable to psychological strain. In our own lives, we may be tempted to immerse ourselves completely in our passions, whether it's building a business, pursuing academic achievement, or dedicating ourselves to creative projects. However, Newton's life shows us that without balance, the pursuit of excellence can come at a high cost. Emotional well-being, relationships, and community are crucial to maintaining a sense of fulfillment and purpose. Success should not come at the expense of personal connection, health, or mental stability. Taking breaks, nurturing relationships, and seeking support when needed are key strategies for maintaining a sustainable and balanced life. We can find ways to pursue our passions without letting them consume us. Second, navigating criticism and perfectionism is essential for personal and professional growth. Newton's paranoia about criticism and his obsession with controlling his intellectual legacy highlight the psychological toll of perfectionism. The fear of failure, rejection, or criticism can drive us to retreat from others, as Newton did, or to become defensive about our ideas. While striving for excellence is valuable, it is equally important to recognize that criticism and feedback are integral to growth. One practical strategy is to cultivate resilience in the face of criticism. Rather than seeing criticism as a personal attack, we can reframe it as an opportunity for learning and improvement. Practicing self-compassion, understanding that mistakes and setbacks are part of the process, can help reduce the fear of failure and the tendency to isolate ourselves in response to negative feedback. Additionally, embracing collaboration and open-mindedness can allow us to gain new insights, challenge our own assumptions, and grow both intellectually and emotionally. Thirdly, embracing the unknown and accepting imperfection are crucial for personal growth and emotional resilience. Isaac Newton's later turn toward alchemy, biblical prophecy, and other mystical pursuits reflects his psychological need for answers to questions that could not be answered through empirical science. His genius in understanding the physical world did not shield him from grappling with deeper existential questions. Ultimately, his obsessive pursuit of absolute knowledge led him into realms of speculation that were both irrational and isolating. In our own lives, we may be tempted to seek absolute answers to life's mysteries, to control every aspect of our environment, or to have perfect clarity in all things. Newton's journey teaches us that part of the human experience is accepting the unknown and embracing imperfection. We do not need to have all the answers, nor can we control everything around us. It is okay to acknowledge that some things are beyond our understanding, and that seeking meaning in areas beyond the empirical, such as through creativity, spirituality, or philosophy, can be a valuable and fulfilling part of life. By accepting uncertainty and the limits of our control, we can free ourselves from the psychological pressures of perfectionism and obsessiveness. We can cultivate peace of mind by learning to live with ambiguity and allowing ourselves to explore questions that don't necessarily have definitive answers. Fourthly, managing obsession and maintaining intellectual balance is essential to avoid burnout and preserve long-term clarity. Newton's obsessive pursuit of knowledge, whether through science, alchemy, or theology, illustrates the dangers of losing balance in our intellectual pursuits. Passion for knowledge is a driving force for progress and personal fulfillment, but when taken to extremes, it can lead to unhealthy obsession, burnout, and psychological distress. For those who are deeply engaged in intellectual or creative work, it is important to find ways to balance passion with self-care. Taking regular breaks, engaging in activities that bring joy outside of our work, and being mindful of the mental and emotional strain that comes with sustained focus are essential practices. Finding a way to step back and reconnect with the world outside our work allows us to recharge and return to our pursuits with renewed clarity and purpose. Isaac Newton's story, with its mixture of unparalleled intellectual brilliance and psychological complexity, offers us valuable lessons about the need for balance, self-awareness, and emotional connection in the pursuit of excellence. By recognizing the psychological and emotional challenges that accompany intense focus and striving, we can create more sustainable paths to success and personal fulfillment. Isaac Newton's later life presents a series of complexities that challenge our simplistic view of genius. His retreat into alchemy, his obsession with biblical prophecy, and his paranoid behavior cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the historical and cultural context in which he lived. In our modern era, we might dismiss some of these pursuits as eccentric or even delusional. But in Newton's time, these subjects were not as clearly delineated from rational science as they are today. Understanding these nuances allows us to appreciate the depth of Newton's intellectual journey, while also providing insight into the psychological challenges that even the greatest minds must confront. It is important to consider that alchemy, for much of Newton's life, was not the discredited pseudoscience that it is often regarded as today. During the 17th century, alchemy was viewed by many as a legitimate area of inquiry, one that straddled the boundaries between chemistry, philosophy, and spirituality. The pursuit of the philosopher's stone, which was said to transform base metals into gold and grant eternal life, was not seen as a quixotic fantasy, but as an intellectual challenge that could reveal deeper truths about the laws of nature. In this context, Newton's deep involvement in alchemy was consistent with the intellectual climate of his time. Alchemists were not only concerned with material transformation, but also with uncovering the spiritual or divine principles behind the natural world. For Newton, the study of alchemy might have served as a means to explore the hidden forces that governed the universe, forces that his scientific work had only begun to uncover. Alchemy, in a sense, was an extension of Newton's broader desire to find order in chaos, to discover the universal laws that governed both the physical and metaphysical realms. Newton's obsession with biblical prophecy is another aspect of his later life that requires careful consideration. Unlike the purely mystical pursuits of some of his contemporaries, Newton's interest in theology was deeply intellectual. He believed that the Bible contained hidden mathematical and astronomical truths that could be uncovered through rigorous analysis, much in the same way he had approached his scientific work. Newton was not simply seeking religious answers. He was searching for a rational explanation of the divine order, much as he had sought rational explanations for the movements of celestial bodies. Newton's theology was also shaped by his personal beliefs and his rejection of certain mainstream Christian doctrines. For instance, he did not accept the traditional doctrine of the Trinity, considering it a distortion of the true nature of God. His religious views were unorthodox, and in many ways, his rejection of established religious beliefs mirrored his broader approach to intellectual inquiry, challenging accepted norms in order to find deeper, more fundamental truths. While Newton's theological studies and his obsession with prophecy might seem peculiar today, it is essential to understand that these pursuits were not seen as entirely separate from his scientific work. For Newton, the study of alchemy and theology was part of the same overarching quest for universal knowledge. In his mind, science and religion were not in conflict. They were two sides of the same coin, both seeking to uncover the mysteries of the universe. Moreover, one of the more speculative aspects of Newton's later years is the possibility that his mental health was influenced by his alchemical experiments. Alchemy often involved the use of dangerous chemicals, and many historians and medical researchers have suggested that Newton's exposure to mercury, a common substance used in alchemical experiments, could have contributed to some of the psychological symptoms that he exhibited in his later life. Mercury poisoning is known to cause a range of symptoms, including paranoia, irritability, and cognitive dysfunction, all of which align with some of Newton's reported behaviors in his later years. While it is impossible to definitively determine the extent to which mercury poisoning influenced Newton's mental state, it is an important factor to consider when examining his psychological profile. If Newton's behavior was partially driven by the physical effects of mercury toxicity, this would add another layer of complexity to our understanding of his retreat into obsession and reclusiveness. It would suggest that his psychological decline was not only a result of personal stress and intellectual strain, but also a consequence of the substances he was working with in his alchemical experiments. Newton's later years force us to confront the complexities of genius itself. In our culture, we often view genius as a singular force of brilliance, untouched by the flaws and vulnerabilities that affect others. But Newton's life shows us that genius, far from being a simple marker of intellectual superiority, is often accompanied by psychological struggles, isolation, and intense pressure. His obsession with preserving his legacy and protecting his intellectual property came at the cost of his emotional and social well-being. His retreat into alchemy and theology reflected his desire to control knowledge that could not be explained through reason and logic alone. Newton's story challenges our traditional understanding of scientific and intellectual achievement. We tend to glorify figures like him as solitary geniuses who shaped the world through their individual brilliance, but we often overlook the emotional and psychological costs of such achievements. Newton's experience serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of intellectual obsession and the toll it can take on a person's mental health. It reminds us that even the greatest minds, for all their brilliance, are still vulnerable to the pressures of society, personal insecurity, and internal conflict. Ultimately, Isaac Newton's life, marked by both extraordinary achievement and psychological struggle, invites us to reconsider what it means to be a genius. His story demonstrates that brilliance is not immune to human flaws, and that the pursuit of knowledge can, at times, come at a personal cost. Newton's intellectual legacy is undeniably vast, but his psychological journey offers an important lesson about the complexities of the human condition. Even in the quest for absolute truth, we must remember to care for our emotional well-being and remain grounded in the reality of our shared humanity. Isaac Newton's legacy is one of the most monumental in the history of science, but his later life offers a profound psychological narrative that reveals the complexities behind intellectual greatness. While his groundbreaking discoveries in physics, mathematics, and optics laid the foundation for modern science, Newton's later years were marked by profound isolation, obsessive behaviors, and paranoia. His retreat into alchemy, his obsession with biblical prophecy, and his intense need to control knowledge highlight the psychological toll of fame, intellectual pressure, and the quest for absolute truth. Newton's life is a powerful reminder that genius, while often celebrated, is not immune to the vulnerabilities and insecurities that define the human condition. His intense intellectual pursuits, while revolutionary, led to psychological struggles that ultimately overshadowed his relationships and well-being. His obsession with perfection and intellectual control left him emotionally isolated and disconnected from the world around him. His retreat into esoteric studies, once regarded as fringe or irrational, represents an attempt to reconcile the limits of his scientific understanding with his deeper spiritual questions about existence. Isaac Newton's later years reveal the tension between the drive for intellectual excellence and the psychological cost of that pursuit. His legacy is not just one of scientific achievement, but of the complex human being behind that brilliance. Newton's life encourages us to reflect on the costs of obsession and the importance of maintaining a balance between intellectual pursuits and emotional well-being, reminding us that even the most brilliant minds face personal struggles that must be acknowledged and understood. Isaac Newton's story challenges us to reflect on our own pursuits and the balance we strike between intellectual ambition and personal well-being. How can we push the boundaries of knowledge without sacrificing our emotional and mental health? What can we learn from Newton's struggles with isolation and obsession? Share your thoughts below, like this video, and subscribe to Behind the Legend for more deep dives into the hidden struggles of history's greatest minds. Let's explore the complexities of genius together and learn from the full spectrum of their experiences. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of Isaac Newton. If you found this exploration insightful, check out our other episodes for more reflections on the inner worlds of history's most iconic figures. Stay curious, stay balanced, and keep exploring the depths of human potential.